joining us. And I know that your reputation. And could you tell me about your introduction in the working in the LG Electronics America?
Certainly. I started with LG in October of 2004, on my birthday, as a matter of fact. I joined as LG's first U.S. General Counsel. I had previously been at Sony Electronics for about 19 years. But my task was to build LGE's first U.S. legal department. And I worked closely with LG headquarters in doing this. And then later, when I became regional general counsel, I also worked very closely with Canada and Mexico. And because of similarities in law, I often would converse with their general counsel in Australia as well. I supervised a lot of key LG projects over the years in the U.S., including their first laundry factory in the United States, which was in Tennessee. This provided me with a great deal of exposure to Korean culture and business practices. And frankly, I also learned to appreciate soju on my trips to Seoul.
Sounds great. And other than the LG Electronics, do you have any experience working in the Korean company?
Not directly, but I worked with and I negotiated with several other Korean companies and Korean support companies to LG, but LG was my only Korean client at the time.
Okay. I've heard that you are now is providing an HR labor consultation to Korean side of the business. So what is a major difference between the Korean and labor law and United States in the labor law?
And that's a very interesting question. And the primary difference is the starting points. And in the US, the starting point is something that's over 150 years old, and that's the employment at will doctrine. An employer is free to fire an employee at any time, and an employee is free to quit at any time. In Korea, on the other hand, there are statutory legal protections that require an employer to have cause or some other legal justification before they can terminate an employee. And so basically the onus is on the company to make the proof in Korea, and in the United States, the onus is on the employee to show some kind of illegal discrimination. It's not a per se labor law as much as it is an anti-discrimination law as it applies to other things other than just employment. Mm-hmm. The other thing, to me, there's one other major point that is very different between US and Korea. In Korea, basically you have one body of law, one central government, one major body of law. In the United States, you have 51 different sets of law. You have one set of law for every state in the United States, plus the federal law, the law of the government of the United States that overlays on top of that. And there's a great deal of variation among the states when it comes to labor law, and particularly when it comes to rules about termination of an employee and discrimination with regard to an employee. It can be very different depending upon which state you're in.
Okay. But whenever I have a conversation with a Korean business owner, there's so many questions happen to me do I have to prepare the handbook? In the handbook in Korea, the 취업규칙 is very well recognized in Korea, 취업규칙, but they wondering that is really in the required by the United States labor law to prepare the handbook.
Well, the handbook is important in both United States and Korea, the employee handbook. Every U.S. company has an employee handbook that lays out the company's policies and procedures. The idea of that in the United States in particular is to show both compliance with the law in their employee handbook, but also to show what their policies will be in terms of an employee's behavior. In short, what might constitute cause for termination if the employee violates some of the company's policies, right? That would be grounds for termination, and that needs to be laid out in the employee handbook, what the expectations are. It also covers all kinds of mundane things like what benefits you will have and who to talk to when you have a benefits issue or something like that. So it covers both these big legal issues and the mundane day-to-day, how you deal with human resources and your supervisor at the company.
Okay. That is really helpful. And by the way, what is the caveat to hire the new employee in the United States? Because in the rush of starting up the business, there is a hire in the United States rather than there is a bringing the someone from Korea. So because they wanted to localize in the United States. So what is the caveat to hire the new employee in the United States?
This is more of a cultural issue, though sometimes it can become a legal issue. There's a great, and I've experienced this many times firsthand while I was at LG. The Korean managers often feel free to ask what are considered very personal and private questions in the United States. They would ask, for example, a woman if she was married, if she planned to have children, if she already had children, etc. All of those things not only are considered private and inappropriate questions in the United States, they can be a violation of the anti-discrimination statutes as well, particularly if it could be shown that the individual didn't get the job because she said she planned to have children, for example, all right, during the interview. Just the asking of the question would be considered discrimination, and could be also, if it became a practice of doing that in all of your interviews, might give rise to a claim for a class action, the class being all of the people who didn't, all the women, for example, using my prior example, all the women who didn't get a job at a particular Korean company after their interview. It'd be a difficult case, but it's the sort of thing that becomes a big nuisance and a big problem in the United States.
Wow, okay. So yeah, but I have, based on my experience working in Korea, so many personal questions when I have interview. So
yeah, they've started to change the law in Korea about that very recently, but there's resistance to. It's a big cultural change for the for Korean, particularly Korean men, I think, in all honesty, to deal with this change. It's going to happen, but it's going to be a generational thing.
Okay. So next question is I'm not licensed Korean law, but in the customary, in the Korean company, in the sign up the employment contract when there is a hire the people before the day starting in the job. But do you think that is in the mandatory to execution about the employment contract in the United States? Because everybody know that it's terminated at any time without cause, with cause in the United States. That's why the start of the business owner they inclining to the thinking, and we can terminate any time the people at any time without cause. So is it possible? Do you think it is mandatory to sign up the employment contract under the customs?
Well, about the employment contract, in Korea, it's part of the law that there has to be a contract between the employer and the employee that has to deal with certain issues about time of reporting and vacation and other issues has to be spelled out. It's kind of a supplement even to the employee handbook. All of that would have been put into an employee handbook in the United States, and as I may have mentioned, in the United States, it is not normal to have an employment contract. It's very unusual, as a matter of fact. The average employee will not get an employment contract. However, if you're a senior executive, a very valuable salesperson or a very valuable marketing person, for example, or research scientist, you might get an employment contract because they want to guarantee themselves that you will stay with the company for a particular period of time. Remember, it's employment at will. Otherwise, the employee is free to leave anytime they want to. With an employment contract, you can probably leave under the terms of the contract or most employment contracts, but you pay a penalty for it. You would forfeit some money or be required to pay some money back to the employer, for example. It also would probably trigger a non-compete, which would limit a non-compete agreement, which would limit where you could go to work if you left ahead of time. It may even, after the end of the contract, trigger a non-compete provision as well. Non-competes are enforceable in many states, but not in every state in the United States. And that's another big area for any company coming to the United States to understand that. Non-competes are difficult to enforce in the United States. But to get back to your question about the contract, it just is very unusual, whereas in Korea, it's commonplace. It is required by law even.
Right. But basically, based on your experiences working in the LG Electronics America, what kind of potential litigation would commonly happen to in the Korean company when they're in connection with employment?
Do you mean in Korea or in the United States, or is your question for both?
In Korea. In
Korea.
I'm sorry, in America. Yeah, of course.
Oh, okay. In Korea, they generally have the Ministry of Labor gets involved and does more of the protection. There aren't as many private lawsuits, though it can happen, particularly with the discrimination. It's getting more frequent. In the United States, the most common that the Korean companies face very often are the discrimination, the anti-discrimination laws. Basically, there is the fear. Very often, it's female. Sometimes it's sexual harassment. Though, frankly, I did not encounter that very often at LG. There's something called workplace harassment, though, where it's not sexual harassment, but it is harassment of a kind of bully. It's more like workplace bullying, if you will, by the boss. And Korean culture, of course, frankly, the boss is supposed to yell at the subordinates. It's expected. It's normal. In the United States, it's just the opposite. We're trying to teach our managers not to do that. All right. It's changing in Korea, in all honesty, in my experience. But in the United States, particularly when I first joined LGE, the local non-Korean employees were very taken aback by the attitude, and it was very hard for many of them to adjust to that. But the interesting thing about Korean culture is, I always said this, the Korean manager may yell at you during the day and tell you to work harder and faster and all of that. And at the end of the day, he or she will say, let's go out to dinner and have something to drink and have a good time and have fun. And it's not held against you. It's almost like a dual personality syndrome, if you will, between the daytime and the evening time working in a Korean company.
Oh yeah, interesting. So
at least from an American standpoint.
Okay. So back into the rear in the previous questionnaire, you are retired from the LG Electronics America, and you're providing your own company to the Korean side of the business in the HR and the labor consultation. Could you tell me about your current business experience? What kind of in the service in specific providing to Korean side of the business owner?
Very good. So far, I've been working primarily with American companies trying to do business with Korean companies, in all honesty. But I have several clients in the retail industry, one in the startup commercial laundry business, and another in the HVAC construction business. And I'm doing both legal and HR, human resources, employment support services in most of those areas. I did serve as the head of HR for LG USA for over a year, as a matter of fact, while I was still the lawyer. So I have both, business experience with HR, and in fact, with two of my retail clients, I've spent a lot of time with HR. In fact, for over 6 months, I was head of both legal and HR, while a retail chain on the West Coast was searching for a new HR head. So I served both functions for them, and I helped them find a new HR head. So I'd like to do the consulting aspect of them, of sharing what I've learned over the years with the companies. And while I do contract negotiation for all of my clients, I think the biggest service I provide for them is the advice on how to avoid the litigation and the problems that they're going to encounter. So I think that's definitely my most valuable service to them. All of my years of experience, I can see the problems coming very often before the client does.
Right, but based on my experience in the likely your qualification in the working experience, 13 of years in Korean company, and you have experience of a Korean in the culture, in the business, in the matter. So I think that you're a very rare person to support in the Korean side of the business in the United States. So
I would welcome that opportunity. Yes.
Yes. So thank you so much, Mr. Wingate, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yu. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Today.